launch of this very exciting report, How Do We Re-energise Britain's Museums? And we've got a really amazing Caroline to my extreme right, no, to my right, just to my right. We were together in a room at 9:30 first thing this morning. And she did say, my day is bookended by Rupa Huck. So my name is Rupa Huck. I'm the Labour MP for Ealing Central and Acton. I'm on Dame Caroline's committee, the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. And those are, actually, they're quite serious select committees. They can subpoena people to attend, they can make them squirm. And we do that every week. We were doing it this morning. It was on school PE, first thing in the morning. So I'm your host for this evening. We also have the good Lord Neil Mendoza, CBE, and he was big in, well, he's still big, but he was particularly the pandemic moment. He was very influential in all our lives by leading the Cultural Recovery and Renewal government programme. He was a commissioner on that, and he's also provost of Oriel College, Oxford University. And for those of us who went to the other place, other alternatives are available. Okay, and we also have, in the middle, Miriam from Demos, who is going to be chairing tonight. And to the side of Miriam, we have Dr. Gus Casely-Hayford, OBE. Everyone's OBE'd or CBE'd or Dame here. I feel very undertitled to be here. So, yes, he's a professor of practice at SOAS, part of University of London, the School of Oriental and African Studies. And he founded the V&A East, which is the outpost of the Victoria and Albert Museum in Stratford. Dr. Scott Anthony has done many things. I think when I first knew you, you were a Guardian football correspondent at one time. But he has reinvented himself, having got himself a PhD since then. He's Deputy Head of Research at the Science Museum, which we all love, especially the basement. Those of us who've had children on a Saturday, best place, take them in the basement and they can run around and not break anything. And he's written a book recently. He's also, the story of film propaganda. Didn't you have a South Bank screening for that? How exciting. Yes. Don't be shy. Come on, Scott. You've come a long way since those football results or whatever it was. And he's also written a novel called Changi. So that is our glittering panel for tonight. Welcome to the Mother of Parliament. As I say, it's a busy time at work. We're all looking forward to the spring statement tomorrow, amongst other things. But I will now hand over to Miriam from Demos.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rupa, for that incredibly warm welcome to Parliament and to this room, and thank you so much for hosting this event. So thank you to Rupa, thank you to my panel, and thank you to all of you for attending tonight. It should be a really exciting and interesting conversation that we're going to have on the panel this evening. We're looking in this event at how we can re-energise the culture and heritage sector in Britain today, so its museums, its libraries, its archives and its galleries. To introduce myself, I'm Miriam Levin. I'm Director of Programmes at Demos. This used to be my world, so I worked at DCMS for a few years, and previously I was Head of Outreach at English Heritage for 8 years. So I feel like I've been around the heritage and museum sector for quite a while, but not for a few years. For those who aren't so familiar with Demos, we're a cross-party think tank. We've been around for about 30 years. And we exist to try to improve our democracy, our digital services, our public services and our economy. And the way we work is to put people at the heart of policy making, trying to build a more collaborative democracy and make it work better for people. Before we kick off with the panel, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are filming tonight's event. It's not being live streamed, but just so you know, it is being filmed for posterity. We're going to be able to put it on our social media, so you can watch it after the event and drive people to watch the videos on the Demos website afterwards. You'll see on your seats, or you've probably got them on your laps now, Demos' briefing paper on re-energising Britain's museums. And this is based on the work of the Joint Programming Initiative on Cultural Heritage and Global Change, who've run a 2-year research project on this topic, and they are funding tonight's event. Their research has shown how expectations and responsibilities of museums have changed significantly over the decades. And that's some of the content that we're going to get into in the discussion tonight, which creates new and challenging, complex challenges for the sector. So to explore those challenges tonight and to think about how we need to respond, I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel tonight. So Rupert's done the introductions, but like I say, we're joined by Dame Caroline Dianage, Lord Neil Mendoza, Dr. Gus Casey Hayford, OBE, and last but not least, Dr. Scott Anthony. To kick us off, I'm going to ask Scott to start by outlining the findings of his research, and then we're going to hear from the other panellists who are going to speak for about 5 minutes. I've got a few questions, Chair's prerogative to ask a couple of questions first, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. So please, as everybody is speaking, get your questions ready, because we really want to have a good discussion going between the floor and the panel. We're aiming to finish up by 7:45 tonight, and then you are free to enjoy the wine at the back and stay around and network and talk to your kind of colleagues and other people in the sector who are here tonight. That's enough from me. I'm going to hand over now to Scott to talk through his findings.
Thank you, Miriam, and good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Anthony, and for the past 2 years, I've been leading a project funded by the Joint Programming Initiative on Cultural Heritage. Although we'll be talking about the UK findings, it's actually a European project, and we have researchers in France, Norway, and Spain. And I guess the thing it seemed worth saying at the start about this research is that although it was kind of initiated or inspired by the sense that museums have become a sort of source of controversy or have been at the series of kind of increasingly kind of interlocking and complex controversies, I'm extremely lucky that the research was funded to be diagnostic rather than prescriptive, which is to say that this evening is a great opportunity for me and for the parts of the project that are here, some of the researchers are in the room, to really kind of air some of our sort of early observations and kind of get feedback and invite feedback from a group of people who can bring a kind of quite a variety of quite sharp insights into some of the issues that the sector faces. Before we go to the panel, I've been asked to say something briefly about the research, how we did it, and why it matters. But I thought I'd start with a quote, which is from one of our kind of practitioner sessions. And so this is the quote. "It felt like the worst thing that could happen was that you missed out. It was like always running to catch a train. We jumped on every train we could. We never stopped to find out where the train was going." End quote. And I wanted to start with that quote because I think one thing that we've realized as a team is that there's often this notion when you're talking about museums that they're kind of static organizations, they're kind of the stereotype kind of wins out. And actually, I think one of the interesting things about museums, especially in the post-war period, and especially even more so since the 1990s, is that actually internally they've changed an enormous amount, right? An incredible amount of change. And I feel like sometimes that the kind of the rapid impacts of this change are really perhaps still greatly underappreciated. As the quote said, we never stopped to find out where it is, where we're going. In terms of research, there's basically two main strands. One is kind of historical, and the other is essentially ethnographic. And in terms of the history, we've been focused on the development of arts policy. And I guess one of the findings has been that the arts policies that were first developed in the UK during the war had a kind of what you might call like a preservation orientation. They were kind of oriented towards the protection and preservation of cultural heritage. But essentially what starts to happen through the post-war period is that this impetus is kind of joined with another one that it operates in tension with, which is what you might call a kind of arts policy based on generation or creation of culture. Very broadly then, you're sort of moving from a paradigm where cultural heritage is about preservation and protection to one where cultural heritage is often about provision and access. And I guess one of our findings of our research is that in the 1990s, this kind of preservation aspect of arts policy starts to become much weaker, if not to completely collapse. Now, it's kind of interesting to think why this might be, and yeah, there's several kind of sort of big picture answers, which might be everything from like the collapse of the Soviet Union to the advent of new digital technologies or a kind of whole wide variety of social and demographic change. But from the point of view of this evening, we're really interested in focusing on the impacts of this change. And in particular, that the purpose of museums, their organisation and staffing, and indeed the incentives they respond to, start to change and indeed change quite rapidly. Briefly, one of the sort of findings that we've had since the 1990s is that museums have begun to focus on, I would say, a narrower range of visible outputs. So this could be, for example, temporary exhibitions, revenue-generating temporary exhibitions, alignment with particular educational policy goals, or expansion through capital growth projects, through capital projects rather. And I guess our argument is that these incentives, which are somewhat narrower, then over sort of a 20, 30-year period, start to change the organizational structure of museums, the kind of staff they have, and the hierarchy that this staff exists in. There's a nice phrase that I've come across in some of our reading that is that budgets are ethics on display. And if you look at a changing budget of, say, of a museum over this period, you essentially see very crudely that curators and collections become less important over time. And I think this shift in incentives, the changes in staffing that they lead to, also have an effect in a way of slightly confusing or complicating the purpose of a museum. And here I want to go back to one of my earlier points. If we think of museums not as kind of static, unchanging organizations, but essentially as people, as collections of people, then the changing in how they're staffed and so on really does make a big difference to the kind of things they do. And on a bad day, or a particularly sort of negative day, we can see that sort of there's a kind of neophyte kind of imperative to a lot of the changes that start to happen. But I don't want to say that it was all bad, or indeed that the period since the 90s has been without success. There have been considerable successes, not least a massive increase in audiences, increase in revenues, lots of new venues, and again, the sense, I guess, that you have of a sizable minority of the public becoming quite invested in museums and cultural heritage, and even becoming a source of pride in sort of a local and national sense. But in recognizing this, it's also worth examining perhaps some of the legacy of that kind of period of expansion, which perhaps might have contributed to some of the problems that the sector faces today. And the observation of our research is that this kind of ultra-generative phase of arts policy has impacted, as I say, the incentives museums respond to, their kind of staffing and organization, and the purposes of the museum in ways in which might stop to give us pause. And so just to round up, I wanted to say why I think this matters, and in particular why it matters now. And this goes, I guess, kind of three reasons that I was kind of thinking of. Firstly is, if we think about the big controversies in the sector recently, the controversies that have gone from the specialist media into the mainstream media, these controversies are all quite interesting in a sense, I think, in the sense that their basis is a kind of weakness of what you might call core museum skills, or a failure of core museum processes, in particular knowledge and care for national collections. Now, it may be in those individual cases there are particular individual reasons or idiosyncrasies that are really just one of a kind, but I guess the thing with our research is that perhaps if it's something more systematic as well, and that this systematic loss of focus is about a misalignment of purpose, people, and incentives. The second thing, and it's something that I try to generally pass over as gently as possible, is, you know, the kind of culture war, I guess, has cast a huge pall over the sector, and indeed, I would say, over the whole of national life over the last 5 or 6 years or so. And I guess one hypothesis of our research, and it's actually a hopeful hypothesis, is that actually the culture war might less be a product of kind of embedded ideological conflict, less a product of kind of indoctrination at university or on the internet or something, and instead actually a symptom of a decline in actual cultural knowledge and authority. Basically, curatorial expertise spread more thinly and incentivized to align with contemporary media trends. So you might have polarization, but essentially it could be quite a skin tight, skin deep polarization. And lastly, I guess it's worth saying that the arts are expensive, and as I guess we're about to find out tomorrow, the largesse that existed in the 90s is not coming back for the moment, or indeed anytime soon. And in fact, that period of expansive generative arts policy probably depended on, was a consequence of, a period of affluence, and perhaps also the kind of unipolar world that emerged with the collapse of the Soviet Union and appears to be disappearing now. But in any case, whether we're in a pause, a shift, or a massive transformation, I would say re-energizing the museum means focusing on core purposes and ensuring that incentives, people, and purposes are aligned, or at the very least, stopping to ask, as we're going to do this evening, where exactly the train is going. Thank you very much.
Scott, can I ask a question? So your work suggested that you think that museums should be thought of in the round and act in the round, not just be judged by the exhibitions that it puts on visibly. Can you say a bit more about how you think that would work in practice?
I suppose, how could it work in practice? The suggestion that we were thinking of, I suppose, or models we were, like, I understand from a politician's point of view, there's always a need and a wish to have a problem that can be solved quickly. And I guess when you're talking about cultural heritage, it's a different sort of political problem because it's also one about custodianship, right? So it's about decisions that will impact the future beyond a political cycle or an electoral cycle or something like that. So I think one can think of sort of models of purpose, and the one we were thinking of was sort of charter renewal in the BBC and these kind of 10-year reviews of sort of purpose that come along. So that seemed one model, and I think the other sort of thing in terms of a more sort of policy-orientated thing was, you know, one thing we've noticed is how much the staffing of museums has changed, and the organisation of museums, and there's a huge generational kind of shift anyway, with a whole generation retiring, and then a whole kind of a generation that's coming up, which might be on fixed-term contracts or shorter, and there's a huge, you can imagine, a kind of whole skills and knowledge gap. So I think if we thought of museums as kind of knowledge systems, which you need to kind of make sure are primed for with a sort of generational objective, I think that would be one way of both having a kind of longer term, or resisting the sort of sugar rush of short-term goals, and kind of building sort of capacity in a meaningful way. Yeah.
Thank you. Caroline, may I come to you?
Good evening, everybody. How lovely to see you. And thank you to Demos for organising this evening's event, and to the wonderful Rupa. You're still there? There she is, for being our host. Now, some of you may or may not know, Rupa and I are the only members of the DCMS Select Committee who were on the committee in the last Parliament, but actually she is the OG. She was on the committee longer than any of the rest of us, and so we sort of look at her as having the sort of the institutional memory of the Select Committee, perhaps an institution in her own right. I think you would all agree. Yeah, well, no, maybe not. So anyway, look, tonight we've got the question: how do we re-energise Britain's culture and energy sector in the museums, more specific culture and heritage sector, and more specifically our museums. But I mean, I don't think we should doubt, first of all, the energy that's already out there, right? You know, that we've got. This is a sector with a tremendous amount of energy, and we've seen some of that in recent years and months, whether that's the record-breaking Van Gogh exhibition, the National Treasures programme that the National Gallery did for their 200th anniversary, whether that was Dippy the Dinosaur going on tour and driving a huge new audience to the Bovington Tank Museum. You know, the Liverpool's Maritime Museum is about to go a massive redevelopment, very ambitious. So, you know, there is a lot of energy and passion, and and there's a lot of sort of people who have got an enormous amount of expertise out there in the sector. But, you know, Scott's research shows there's much more than can be done that can create a national purpose for museums and ensure that that energy can grow. But most importantly, that it spreads, and it spreads right across every corner of our nation and to all different aspects of society. So one of the best things about being the chair of the Select Committee, and previously I was the Culture Minister for a couple of years as well, is that you get to go behind the scenes, you get to go kind of backstage at some of our great cultural institutions, and museums are no different. So last year we got to go and visit the British Museum. Now, the reason we went there because we wanted to sort of get a little bit of reassurance that things were under control after a few items found their way on eBay. No, that didn't happen. But, you know, a few things were mislaid from their collection. But when we were there, we had just the most remarkable experience. We had a sneak preview of the Legion exhibition and saw the research and the preservation work that was going on to support that exhibition. But also some of the facilities and some of the great expertise that they have backstage. It was a real eye-opener. But of course, what we realised is that not every museum and gallery can have that sort of expertise and that sort of understanding, or even the amazing facilities that they've got there. Which is why I was really taken with the building foundational knowledge and curatorial expertise as one of the key pillars of this paper. Because when I speak to museums beyond London, it's lovely that they get artefacts or paintings or, you know, historic things to display, but actually one of the things that they really value is the advice, the support, the expertise that can provide so much impact. And that also, I mean, that kind of has legs that actually last longer than a temporary exhibition or display. And those skills and expertise are, I think, absolutely central to developing this kind of ecosystem of collections that support each other and are able to help the whole sector thrive. So just wanted to talk to you very, very quickly about the work of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee. I noticed that, and you did mention it a minute ago, Scott, you talked about the comparison with the BBC Charter, which is a fascinating one. The government is about to embark on that process all over again, and in the committee we'll be doing our bit, won't we, to scrutinise that as it moves forward. Quite often when we come to the BBC, we spend a lot of our time asking what they've done wrong. We are often hoiking dear Tim Davie and Samir Shah in front of us to put them through a grilling. But, you know, maybe there are areas where this sector could learn from the BBC, and I'm sure that maybe the next time they appear in front of us, they'd be happy with that as a question rather than all the other things that we grilled them with a couple of weeks ago. But, you know, that has issues in and of itself. And then turning to the third pathway that Scott identified, promoting experimentation and creativity. That's not the first time this year that I've heard different parts of the cultural sector talking about this. This is a theme that comes up all the time. So in January, I was at the National Theatre. They launched their report, this really sort of galvanising report called Scene Change. It looked at performing arts spaces right across the country of all different sizes and scales, and particularly at their business models and their sustainability and how they're captivating, they're capturing the most amount of expertise and all the latest best practice of spaces up and down the country. And their report called for innovation and resilience, which I thought was really important, as well as the sustainability that I already talked about. And it recognised that not everyone can afford the risk-taking that some of the many cultural institutions would really like to undertake. And that was something we talked about a lot. So I hope today's research will be really good way of provoking a wider discussion about what can be done to support innovation at the same time that there are financial challenges that are affecting so many of these sectors and the museum sector in particular. And as well as making the case to government, you know, our role in the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee is to be to challenge the government, but we also want to listen, and we also want to be able to advise and to give really good advice based on the expertise that we've heard. So we're going to start taking evidence later on in the spring, once we've got our latest report, which is on film and high-end TV, out of the way, which will be published before the spring recess. Then Rupa and I and the rest of our gang are going to be moving on to an inquiry onto protecting built heritage. We're hoping Lord Mendoza will come and give us evidence. I'm being very nice to him in the hope that he will be one of our evidence sessions, and that's. So we're not focusing on the collections in that inquiry, but we're talking really about the bricks and mortar. We're talking about what can be done to make sure the institutions themselves, the galleries, the libraries, the museums, the archives, have permanent and accessible and sustainable homes that allow them to preserve our history, because we've all heard the horror stories about, you know, roof tiles blowing onto motorways and collections being endangered. So that's something that we want to be able to look at in more detail over the months ahead.
Thank you. You talked about your role on the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee and the role that committee plays in holding the government to account. Can I ask how close a role do you think the government should play? Is this working? Yeah, I'll try that. Thank you. Is that better? Yes. There we go. Sorry. So my question was, how close a role do you think the government should play in guiding or providing a sense of purpose to the sector?
There we go. So obviously a really important role in funding, and particularly for our national galleries. But the thing is, I think if you take a too close a role in the guiding or setting the purpose for the sector, then it's you can really easily risk sort of curatorial decisions tipping over into political decisions. So I think there's a real balance to be struck here. With the national museums, there is a kind of formal sponsorship role, and sometimes I hear concerns that the department aren't that interested until something goes wrong, which, you know, you can understand, because the department's got a lot of things to be concerned about, and of course, you know, people beat a path to their door when there's a need for capital investment, as I spoke about earlier, and that sort of relationship can suit many museums and galleries and other places most of the time, but if there is more the government could be doing to promote, then I think it's probably about how we support the spread of those skills and that expertise and that knowledge, as particularly outside of London, and the way that we can share that thinking of the national galleries right down to, you know, from in my constituency, the Gosport Gallery is like a really integral little part of our local history, and has so much potential to be a real cornerstone of our local community. So that I think is the area where government could help the most.
Mendoza, may I come to you for your thoughts?
Yeah, so the question is, how do we re-energise Britain's culture and heritage sector? Or it's how do we re-energise the museum sector? We're not quite sure. That presupposes that the museum sector is de-energised, and I would argue that it isn't necessarily, and that it's quite a variable picture. The museum sector is a very broad sector. You've got national museums, civic museums, university museums, national trust museums, independent museums, so there's a very different picture depending on where you are. I just saw you've probably seen the ALVA statistics last week that were launched, the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions, and it's a mixed picture. Some museums, Natural History Museum and others, well up on pre-COVID levels. Others, Tate, well down. So it's very hard to look at any one thing. So I'm going to argue that in order to understand it, we've got to think about the landscape that we're swimming in. So many people say it's so tough. I was with Sharon Ament yesterday of the London Museum. She said, I've been in this career, I think she said something like 30 or 40 years, and there's always been a crisis, and it's always been tough. So I would argue at the moment we're in a challenging fiscal environment. We know that. It may get worse tomorrow. We're not sure. We're in an environment where habits have changed post-COVID. There's no question that certain groups of people are not doing cultural things as much as they once did, and that's not only older people, it's young people too. One of the things I'm most concerned about is the fabric of our cultural environment. There was a report done by the last government called the Purcell Report, which never saw the light of day. But in that report, and I haven't read it, it discusses all of the cultural fabric, if we think about, across the heritage sector, performing arts, museums, even the university sector. A lot of it is crumbling, a lot of it is listed, and it's a very big problem, particularly for the museum sector. And the other thing that we've got to think about is the competition. There's a competition for people's time, and there's a competition for people's money. And there's only so much leisure time that's available. And the universe is completely, you talked about film and high-end TV. People are spending hundreds and hundreds of pounds a year on subscribing to Apple, to Netflix, to Hulu, to, you can go on and on, BBC. So many. And TikTok, of course, is using up people's time. So, I think we shouldn't feel too bad that habits have changed, because I think there's so much that is up against us. And it's not just museums who have that. It's the PSBs, Channel 4 and ITV are also suffering as a result of that competition. You touched on the fundamental tension that arts organisations have.
Are we there for art's sake? Are we there to fulfil the curatorial mission, to promote, to preserve, to protect, to educate? Or are we there because we're funded by government and because we're funded by the Arts Council or the lottery, all these things? Are we there to have other purposes and other uses? And that's always the fundamental tension. And so at Historic England, for example, where I'm chairman, on the one hand, yes, we must protect and preserve rather than educate and all that stuff, but we're also incredibly instrumental. So we would always argue to the government, right on your missions, we want growth, we want to help regenerate places. We were thrilled, amazingly, you'll be pleased to hear that the Thames Valley Crossing was approved today, because Historic England has been working incredibly closely with National Highways on that £10 billion project to make sure that we can mitigate the harm as that project goes all the way from the north in the M25, burrows under the river and pops up again at the M20, going past hundreds of thousands, I think, of listed sites, protected landscapes. But we'll work there to make sure that communities are protected as much as we can. And by the way, National Highways love having us involved, because it means the more we're involved, the less protest and and the more buy-in they're going to have from communities. So that's a tension that we've got to think about. I think curators are still incredibly important. When I talk to philanthropists, the curators are the celebrities of our sector. That's who the philanthropists, they don't care about whatever government policy they're. They want to know that this person, this man or woman examining the Iron Age hoard that was on the news today in Durham is an expert in their field, and that's what gets them incredibly excited about it. So I feel very strongly that curators are in good shape. And also, of course, when we want to think about the government, we want, as cultural sectors, to help government meet their missions on growth. This government is actually quite interested in the area you're interested in, on creative health and well-being, and we do a lot of work in that area. And in terms of research, one of the things I really want people to be interested in is the research that I chair the board for at DCMS. Amazing, as a Tory, I'm still somehow at DCMS. I don't really quite know how this happened. But I chair Culture Heritage Capital, this programme of long-term research to try and evaluate all of the outputs of culture. Now, to many, that seems like anathema. Who wants to measure this and put it into pounds and pence? But we have to, so that the outputs can accord with the Treasury's Green Book, so that when we present investment projects to the Treasury, they can go, oh, I see, that's £5 per head of well-being value to these people. We can add it all up, and therefore to spend 10 million here seems like it makes sense. So these things are really important and will help re-energise the sector. In terms of re-energising, I was pleased by Lisa Nandy's recent announcements on culture. And we should all be pleased in these sectors, because they were all related to either museums or heritage in one way or another. performing arts, I mean, the other sectors, one reason, I don't know why, but they didn't get included. There was more money for national museums, there was a good chunk for civic museums, and that's been a long time coming. There was some money for Heritage at Risk, and then there was an extension of MENT, which was Lisa Ollerhead's scheme at DCMS that was named after me. Is that right? No. It was named after, that helped museums with those projects that were really hard to fundraise for philanthropically. All the back of house stuff and the plumbing and the roofs that need repairing. So I was quite encouraged by that. It's still relatively small amounts of money. It doesn't go as far as where as giant programs like the Cultural Recovery Fund, but it's a start. So I think that I'm not as pessimistic as to think we necessarily need to re-energise it. There are plenty of incredible people and places in this sector, and I think we're about to hear from Gus, so it's not over yet. Thank you.
I'm really going to try. Can everyone hear me at the back? So, Lord Mendoza, you produced a 2017 review of museums, and in that you set out a wide range of recommendations about how government could enable museums to flourish, particularly looking at how DCMS could work closely with its bodies and have a greater strategic focus across kind of DCMS and the bodies that it supports. To what extent do you feel that change has actually taken effect, and has the role of museums changed as a result?
I'm laughing I'm looking at Lisa Ollerhead. So Lisa Ollerhead was the official who worked with me very closely on it at DCMS, and she's now the head of the Association of Independent Museums. So when you do a review like this, you go and hover over officials like Lisa, and you say, "What have you done it yet?" So we came up with a set of recommendations. So a couple of things I was really proud of in that report. One is that we tried to isolate all the different ways that government touches the financing of the museum sector. And we came up with something like 16, at least 16, maybe 20 different sources of money, and which people are often surprised about. It wasn't just DCMS, it wasn't just the lottery or Historic England, or it could also be various different kinds of tax schemes that are available for the sector. So that's one thing. So that we can understand that, it's important to do that, to be able to measure the impact of government. And remember, government isn't always involved. Richard Ollenden, who runs GLAM at Oxford University, manages to get by with not an enormous amount of government support, a little bit from the Arts Council, but most of it is self-generated, and that's a completely different model. I suppose the main thing of the report says we've got this incredible museum sector. At the time, there were 1,312 accredited museums in England. That's a lot. People think that they're only the national museums, and they think that the policy of free entry to museums is for everyone. It's not. It's just for the government museums, excluding the Museum of the Royal Navy for a different reason. We said that the Arts Council have an influence, Historic England have an influence, the Lottery have an influence, DCMS has an influence, and it went on and on. All these different bodies sort of interfere or try to moderate the museum sector in some way. So what we tried to say was, all you lot, this is what you're supposed to do, and we put the Arts Council, as it were, in charge of the sector, and encouraged all the various different organisations to work much more closely together. And I think that's happened. I don't know what everybody feels. I'd be interested to know what people feel. But I know that certainly Historic England, we work really closely with the Arts Council now, and we try and work as closely as we can with the lottery, so that we're not either duplicating or missing out on opportunities to encourage the sector to grow.
Thank you. And finally, Gus, can I turn to you?
Thank you. I just want to start by saying thank you, Lord Mendoza, for your encouragement, but also kind of thank you, Scott and Demos, for creating this opportunity to kind of think about these issues. And they are kind of very present in the mind for everyone who kind of works in museums. And this is a really thorough, thoughtful interrogation of where we are now and what the challenges are, but also some of the areas in which we might begin to kind of think about what some of the new solutions might be. But what I would say is that I agree with Lord Mendoza that we are in so much better shape than this might kind of suggest. That I have worked in national museums on 3 different continents. Before I was the director of V&A East, I worked as the director of one of the Smithsonian museums. Now, the Smithsonian museums are one of the finest museum consortia on earth, incredibly well resourced, amazing collections, staff which are astonishing. And I worked there for 4 years and thoroughly enjoyed it. This was in a period of some economic challenge, but there were resources to implement many of the changes that I wished. But I spent a lot of my time hankering after the museum sector here. This sector is the finest on earth, and I would challenge anyone to point to a better sector. There may be sectors which are better resourced. There may be some sectors that can boast, in terms of their collections, either greater variety or perhaps in some areas greater quality. But in terms of the broad offer, the free offer, in terms of the quality of collections that you can get access to in most of our major cities, in terms of the quality of the expertise and the dedication of those experts, I say that this particular nation is unrivaled. And I am so proud to be part of this sector. And then the question, how do we re-energize our sector? I actually think it's about us confidently looking backward, looking at the things that created this sector, that underpin it in terms of principles. If you look at the founding drive for the establishment of the British Museum, it's so radical. This is an institution that was founded on the basic kind of premise that this was for all studious and curious people. This was about learning, it was about inspiration, but the critical word in that sentence is all. All. It was about engaging in that period, in the middle of the 18th century, with the idea that this nation that was coming into being as a modern state, that it could engage with all of its constituencies through a museum, that it could build a national narrative that was both constituted through its collections, but also through the narratives that were articulated from our collections. And that powerful mandate is something that when we came to establish 100 years later, the museums in South Kensington, you look at the basis on which they were created. Again, truly, truly radical. The V&A, an institution that opens in the evening so that it's not just a space within which people who don't work can actually come. An institution that has free and openly accessible libraries. It has cafes so that you can come both and relax, but you can also come and study. And the idea of it being a space that can transform life. And those constituent parts of a kind of philosophical basis upon which the V&A was created are things which you will still see current as part of the DNA of the national offer today. And the way in which we have embraced those things, it may well be that there are more blockbusters now, but visit one of the Smithsonian museums. Look at the numbers of visitors. Look at who they are. And you will get a sense of how we here in this country, we don't just cater to bigger audiences, but we also cater to audiences that are much more demographically complex. We should be so proud of that. And then I begin to think about the things that coaxed me back to this nation, to craft a new V&A East. And we could have built a new V&A East, which is based around us losing our collection store. We could have chosen to have put our new collection store on a university campus, somewhere that would have been cheaper for us. But we wanted to invest in some of the most culturally underserved communities, not just in this country, but in Europe, to create a completely state-of-the-art new proposition for for Britain. A collection store that is open and accessible, that anyone can engage in, anyone can come without an appointment, and not just see objects, but handle them. And the idea is that you can turn up, you don't have to have a PhD to be a museum specialist, anyone can come. And then to build a brand new museum that helps us to interrogate the proposition of the arts through a new lens, through lenses that we hope will really speak to a younger generation, through frames of thinking about issues of sustainability and equity, the sorts of things that for the under 30s are really important. So this is money in part that has come from DCMS, but also from local government. But it's also fueled through the needs of the local populations that we serve. We've asked them what they want, and this is what they want. Of course, they want digital provision to do wonderful and exciting things, to be able to analyse our collections. But what they want is access to truly amazing things. We have 5,000 years of the story of human creativity. You can come in and get up close to it, work with our experts. I completely disagree that we have lost expertise. Come to the V&A. I think we have some of the best teams to help you navigate through recent and ancient histories that relate to culture. And we have built those connections with tertiary education institutions so that you can now come into our space, be inspired, but you can also think about how you might shift your aspirations too, how you may actually live through our collections and think of how you might actually become someone that we might eventually collect. And this isn't something which is happening in a vacuum. Just this morning I visited my 81st school, taking objects into those schools in East London, talking about them and reminding these young people that these collections belong to them. These are public collections. And this is a moment in time in which, as you absolutely rightly say, Scott, there is a shift in expectation, shift in technologies. But we can use this as an opportunity to re-engage our collections in broader discourse. For me, I think, I'm not ancient, but this is the most exciting period that I've ever lived through in terms of my professional work. I was so proud that just last year, we, along with the British Museum, along with the Fowler, that we returned on long-term loan objects that had been stolen in the 1870s from what was then the Gold Coast, is today Ghana. And they are on display there in Kumasi for those local populations to enjoy. So we are thinking about our responsibilities in so many broad ways, whether it be to local populations or to the global, whether it be in terms of thinking about how we extend the reach of the stories that we tell, or in interrogating those collections in our spaces. I feel enormously proud to be part of this sector, and I actually think, in terms of the re-energisation of our sector, we just need to continue thinking about the principles upon which we were founded. These are collections that are public, that were created for all of us, within that very simple premise, in an age in which digital possibilities mean that when we say all, we don't have to mean on behalf of the population. We can mean truly with and by the population. I think this is the most exciting time in terms of museums in which I've lived through, and I look forward to the next 5 years, particularly as I see at places like V&A East, museology truly flowering. Very excited.
Can I ask you guys, so you've talked about kind of the role of the particularly the local public and public around the V&A East. Can I ask if you think the public has a role, kind of the wider public has a role in helping to create or co-create kind of the sector's sense of itself, the sector's sense of purpose? Where do you think the public can play a role in that creation?
Well, as Scott was saying earlier, that museums, that it's not a kind of a closed or a finished proposition, that we've always been iterating over the last 270 years, that national museums have always been in conversation with their audiences, with government, with artists and makers, in thinking about how they might change. And today there are more ways in which we can engage in discourse of a variety of different kinds in thinking about how we can reshape our remits, our focus, our programs, the areas of priority, the people that we work with and the people that we choose to kind of direct our resource toward. And with the making of V&A East, that we have constituted a number of localized committees who have overseen every single area of development, everything, from curation to the ways in which the spaces look and feel. That they've worked with the architects, they've worked with the audience development specialists in creating a museum that doesn't just speak to the nation, but speaks to a younger, more diverse population than any national has served. You visit most nationals and you see people that they look like us, our sort of age, our kind of general demographic profile. And we were keen that the audiences in our space would look like the sorts of people that I see when I visit the local schools in East London. And so we have asked them what it is that they want. And it's just that simple. And as a generation, they are deeply articulate, deeply passionate. They want to see the world change. They know exactly how they would like it to change. And museums, rather than being or feeling redundant, this is the space within which British history is materially palpable, in which they can get involved in thinking about questions of colonialism, of gender, of all areas of politics, of reshaping the world in ways in which make them feel comfortable and relevant. The curriculum hasn't moved swiftly enough to address this, but they are really keen that they can get into spaces like museums and deal with it. I go to kind of schools, and the spaces that are being closed down because there isn't resource tend to be the art spaces. They are now leaning on museums for that additional resource. We need to be there for them. So there are lots and lots of ways in which people need us. And of course, government is always thinking or painting a picture of the arts as something which is not vital. But talk to young people. They talk about the arts in terms of need. That is our answer. That dynamism, that energy, and that need is our answer. That's our future. So I feel, in terms of re-energizing museums, the energy is there. The need is there. We just need to push on with a degree of confidence.
Amazing, thank you. I'm going to open up to the floor now. I'm going to ask, if you've got a question, please raise your hand. If you could introduce yourself, tell us your name, maybe where you're from, and keep your question nice and brief, no grandstanding, please. Sorry, the last thing is, we're going to give you a microphone, which is not actually going to amplify your voice in the room, it's for the recording, so you're still going to have to speak up so the rest of the room can hear you, but we're going to hand you that to speak. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Lady at the front, gentleman there in the yellow. I'll take 3 questions to start with. And yeah, lady.
Hello, I'm Liz Forgan. Thank you very much, everybody. That was a really cheery session. I expected to be depressed, but it was especially great to hear Gus. I thought of Elizabeth Esteve Cole, who ran once upon a time the V&A, was driven out of the profession because she dared to suggest that it would be a good idea to actually invite people into the bloody museum. So it's really, I think we've won that argument. I really do. But to come back to the question of curators and the report for a minute, the bit that worries me is that I think that this report is right in saying that the place that needs attention is the curators. I think they have lost importance, and I think it's a very dangerous thing that it should be so. I differ from the report in a little respect, I think, I've only read it briefly, it seems to me to suggest that one of the reasons they have lost importance is that they've been forced to concentrate on non-core activities, which I take to mean finance and management. I would like to argue the absolute opposite. I've spent a bit of time on the boards of the BBC and the British Museum, and in both places drove me completely mad by finding brilliant artists and creative people who absolutely refuse to read a balance sheet or understand profit and loss, let alone the concept of opportunity cost, which just means choice. And I kept trying to persuade them that if they didn't make the choices, the accountants would. And one of the reasons why curators have lost importance is because they have not equipped themselves with those basic skills. I don't want them to be chartered accountants. I just want them to know the language to control the choice making. Thank you very much.
Can I just check, was there a question?
Well, do you agree with me?
Thank you. My name's Graham Henderson. I've run a couple of arts organisations over the last 25 years. Lord Mendoza, you talked about the attention economy. I'm just really wondering whether we're framing this conversation slightly wrongly in that museums, and I'm on the board of a small museum, I think have an amazing rich content. And that if we reframe it in terms of the rich content that we have and the storytelling, which, as you say, Gus, the British museum sector is particularly good at telling our stories and really world leaders in that. I think there's surely a way in which we can monetize this content. And I think of the Wellcome Collection, which of course benefited from outside investment from Wellcome Trust, but a rather old-fashioned Victorian collection was reframed as a hub, as a centre for all sorts of activities and for all sorts of temporary exhibitions, and is now advanced as a model of best practice. Is this not the sort of model we should be looking at? The other question for the panel really is about civil society. That's something I've not heard of from you yet. Is, for me, the museum sector plays such an important part in the role of citizenship and in it helping us all to articulate our place and our identity. And I would be very interested to hear from a panel particularly about that.
Hi, Denise Farmy from Freedom in the Arts and actually ex-Arts Council. I've written this question down because I'm a little bit nervous and I'm conscious it's being recorded and I have an anecdote to share. So, Scott, I think you've presented us with a significant challenge and I don't think the panel has actually answered that challenge. And your challenge is, what's the purpose? What is the structure of museums? And really, I would say, what is the priorities of museums? And you know, within a fiscal landscape, that is the question we've got to ask. So the anecdote, and I hope my husband isn't going to watch this, my husband runs an out-of-London local authority museum service, and naturally he's very hands-on. Because they've got hardly any staff, for the first time they've brought in 2 apprentices who attend college in London once a week. Now, they both build exhibitions and curate exhibitions. They're those 2 people, technical and curatorial. This week, my husband told me that after a year, he was shocked to find his apprentices, who are lovely, wonderful people, and in their 20s, didn't know the difference between a nut, a washer, and a bolt. Now, they're building exhibitions. Now, so I was shocked, and I said, well, what are they doing at college every week? Well, they're doing decolonisation at college every week. They're not learning how to build exhibitions, how to acquire collections, how to preserve a collection, how to make exhibitions. They're doing political theory. So what is the priority? In museums where resourcing rolls of masking tape, I kid you not, has to go through a number of different channels, can't get through procurement, what is the priority for museums outside London when acquisitions and display, there aren't the funds for that, and so it's being diverted into political endeavours? And regarding the systemic issues, Scott, that you raised, which I think is really important to look at, now, Arts Council accreditation, 1,312 museums have secured accreditation. But accreditation is overly politicised. It is geared towards political objectives and not the preservation of objects and the presentation to the public. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, panel, we have 3 questions. One is should curators be focusing not just on their core skills, but also on the kind of financial aspects and understanding what that actually looks like? In terms of the rich content and storytelling powers that museums have, can this be monetised in a sort of different way? Should we be looking at a different model for how museums work? And also, I think there was something really important there about the role of civil society and kind of what's the role of museums in terms of articulating identity and citizenship. And then the last question, I'm going to try and summarise it as kind of what is the priority for museums, and in a context of a potential politicisation of museums, what's the role of curators in that? Who wants to kick us off?
I can start on... Sorry. I'd like to start on the storytelling question from Graham, because I think it's absolutely fundamental to the survival of some of our regional museums. And we recently went through a really big restructuring of the Gosport Gallery in my constituency, which I have to say I hadn't been a frequent visitor up until the point that it was redesigned and represented. And now I'm a huge fan of, because what they've taken is a collection of historical artifacts that date back to the sort of history of the town over the ages. Some of them are quite random, and they've represented it in lovely, and I think how things look is really important. They're in really nice cases and it's beautifully laid out. But the key thing that makes it utterly compelling is the fact that every single artifact is told through the story of a person. So it's a motorbike that used to be made at the motorbike factory that used to be there, and it's the story of someone that used to work there. And that I think is wonderful. But the way it sort of ties in with the question about identity and citizenship, we live in a world which is increasingly polarised, where people are facing so many pressures from so many different directions. Sometimes if we can come together and talk about the stuff we have in common, it's just so valuable. And it just and the gallery, since it's been refurbed, is now such a wonderful space to be able to do that. I've been to 2 or 3 events over the last few months, which I can tell you about, which were just utterly exemplify that. We went to an event that as part of the Heritage Open Days. They started in Gosport, but now they're all over the country, where you can. You literally can't swing a cat in my constituency without knocking down half a dozen listed buildings. So we've got, especially forts, we've got millions of them. So our heritage is really a really sort of integral part of what we do. But they did a lovely event at the gallery, and it was the smells of old Gosport, and the room was packed. And they went through, and some of them were, smells that anybody of a certain age would reminisce, like things like coal tar soap and certain cleaning fluids. But some of them were very specific to the Gosport area and the sort of military heritage and the sort of industry that used to be there, and et cetera, et cetera. But it was just and it just had a whole range of age groups in there. It really brought people together in a sort of sense of community about the stuff that we can all sort of unite behind. They've done a whole range of other events, and I think that is a remarkable way of reimagining the spaces that actually we thought maybe were a bit fusty and musty and not really wildly interesting or entertaining, and now suddenly it becomes something that really, every time you go there, you read a story, it touches a chord with you, and it gives you something to remember.
Do you want to touch on the question of kind of the role of curators and kind of the financial choices that they maybe should take more of an active role in?
No, I think Dame Liz Forgan is right, and Liz was chair of the Arts Council as well for quite a long time. until she was kicked out by the Tories, but we won't mention that. Is that right? Something like that. No, she's right. Listen, everybody, and it's not just in the museum sector, in the university sector, right across the cultural sector, it's important that everybody at every level has some sort of financial numeracy so that they just have the capability to be able to understand, as you say, a balance sheet or a budget and not be excluded from the discussion. So I completely agree with that, and I know that it happens, and it would definitely protect curators in some way. The point about operating models is well taken, but every museum, as what I was trying to get, is completely different. If you're and every museum will have a different operating model. You might be a tank museum, you might be a natural history museum, you might be a museum of antiquities, or a science museum, or a gallery, or a National Trust house. Each one is completely different and will have to find its own way of, as you say, using its rich content to develop a model. So I think there is definitely not one way, and that's what's so brilliant about our sector, is that there are so many different ways of doing it. If you look at, again, I keep pointing at Lisa. Lisa knows the answer to this because she runs the Association of Independent Museums. She knows what happens to organisations. One of my favourite museums is when I did the review, was the Watch Museum in Tynemouth near Newcastle, which is a small museum, a community museum right on the coast. And not only is it an incredible museum of marine life, but it also operates a live marine rescue service as well. And that is so much a part of the community, and it does weddings and it does parties and it does all sorts of things in the museum, and so therefore it's absolutely a vital part of civic society. And by the way, I think it's not just museums. I think all cultural institutions, whether they're performing arts companies, dance or music or orchestra, they also have an incredibly important part to play in being the glue that brings civic society together. And in different towns and cities, villages, it's different. It can be different cultural forms. You don't have to have all forms represented in every place.
Thank you. And Gus, do you want to pick up on the politicisation question?
Not hugely, but I'm happy to do it. I think museums have always been political. It may be that it's felt less visible than it does now because there has been a kind of more profound shift over the course of the last generation. But the British Museum comes into being to craft narrative. It's a way of kind of weaving us together through a museological framework. And so by necessity, it has to take certain kinds of ideological position, that it is, I think, pretty much de facto. It has a kind of a political position that it's holding and that it maintains, and that is absolutely kind of fine. That we need to accept that. But what it has been open to is the idea of iteration and change, and all museums, over the course of their lifespan, that they do change and they evolve, and the best ones that they understand that they need to be in dialogue with their kind of their audiences, with their constituencies, and they manage to build a kind of relationship within which there is a kind of dialectical balance. And I think that, when it's at its best, is beautiful. But then on the side of whether people should be, in terms of their roles, being trained in the technical things, or whether they should be considering some of those broader issues of approach, I think we have to do both. I mean, a good museum of medium scale, will have dozens of different kinds of roles. In a national museum, you are probably talking of many, many, many dozens of different kinds of discrete roles, each one of which would require tertiary level training. And so it's great if people are aware of a variety of different sorts of ways in which the institution may kind of call upon their colleagues, but they need to have kind of core areas of focus. And then that will, of course, by necessity, mean that we can't be masters of of all trades. But I think that is something that we accept as modern museums, that we work together as communities of specialists to try to bring the best to the remits that we offer. And I think that is something which has strengthened museums over the period that I've worked in them. And I think in this country that we do it very well.
Thank you. Scott, was there any of those questions you'd like to pick up on?
I guess just a couple of things from the conversation more broadly, I suppose, which is to say that, obviously I'm presenting research, and the research is from practitioner interviews, from historical research. So it's not necessarily Scott says this or Scott says that. I obviously wrote down lots of quotes, which I then kind of passed over and didn't really use in my little sort of introduction. But to give you an example of one, it says, so much of the focus on what curators and collections do seems focused on exhibitions and gallery outputs, rather than the need to build collections knowledge and an understanding of the relationship that collections and archives can develop with audiences. So I guess it's a slightly more subtle distinction than the one Lord Mendoza was drawing, in the sense that it's not necessarily bad if you know your collections and you build out the audiences and the outputs is well-being, like this is actually a good thing. It's more like if you start with, we want to show well-being, we better produce some bureaucrats who can measure well-being, and then your museums or institutions start filling up with people. So it's the kind of reverse engineering that is the problem, I would say, rather than necessarily trying to draw a distinction between what curators want to do and what audiences want is I agree, wrong, and not something that personally I would try and do. Again, I'm trying to reflect what was said in the course of the research. And I guess the sort of the business model thing I'm a little bit skeptical of, I think. As Rupa alluded to, I used to work for Chris Anderson, who set up TED, and then I worked at Guardian Unlimited. I worked on the iPad edition of the Times, and this kind of digital business model never seems quite to kick into action. It's always a good way to lose money. And I think, with the historical part of the research, I actually feel like that term that sort of has a moment in the 90s, creative industries, was slightly damaging, actually, because actually a lot of the arts are sort of intrinsically loss-making, in a sense of, it's kind of an old idea, like if you have a string quartet or a paper conservator, like this is very labor-intensive, skills-intensive work that is difficult to make productivity gains on, and as such becomes more expensive over time, and so on and so forth. So I feel like that's why it's important to have a sense of purpose and have a sense of values and have a sense of skills, because that's the only way that you'll ever protect the arts from cuts, essentially. Yeah.
And I think on that note, because we are 5 minutes late for giving you your wine, we're going to draw it to a close. But I just falls to me to thank our panel, to Scott, to Gus, to Neil, and to Caroline. If you join me in saying thank you very much. And with that, please enjoy a glass of wine, network, enjoy the space.